Wrath tends to be something that sometimes would seem to be justified because of righteous wrath. It's sometimes used with God, that God exercises his anger against those who sin. Wrath is basically a pretty antiquated or archaic term. Anger, however, has become a very plebeian term. People talk about anger management, etc. When we talk about the sin of anger, it isn't that people don't get angry. Of course they get angry. Anger is the sense that I myself do not have to be in appropriate control of my emotions, and I can be able to seek revenge. I can give vent to my resentment regardless of consequences. That's what anger is. People are angry about so many different things, but usually they're angry about stuff which is an area where they either can't do anything about or it's safe. It's much harder to rage against something about which you can do something. We should be angry against injustices, whether those injustices are against ourselves, the people for whom we're responsible, or the wider world. Because if you're not angry, you're indifferent. If you don't recognize that there are injustices against yourself, you're probably a doormat. God does not call us to be a doormat. That humility, which is the antidote to pride, humility does not mean you're a doormat. Humility and meekness means that I know who I am, and I can set aside anger, which takes work, by the way. You know, revenge is mine, saith the Lord. It's not yours, it's mine. Okay. In our instance, meekness says, I can bear all things for Christ, as St. Paul says. The difficulty is, how do you take this natural emotion, right, and be able not to let it ride you, but instead, as the Greeks would say, be the charioteer and not the horse? Why is it that people from, good backgrounds can do evil things? That's something that has been perplexing humanity, really from, as I say, the time that people have first been able to think, because it really affects you. It affects every single person. Otherwise, people wouldn't put locks on doors, right? And otherwise, this idea of complete honesty would just be the norm, but it's not. And so therefore, you have to say, is it that human beings are innately good, or is it that human beings are innately evil? If people's rage, anger, causes the death of another person, we tend to stop and say, were they really responsible or not? Increasingly in society, we say, well, you should have been responsible. If you were of a certain age, you should know that if you are liable to a berserking rage, that could cause serious harm or death. I would say murder is one of the most chilling acts of evil that we have ever, because you've taken something that can never be replaced. We see within scriptures, we see all kinds of stories of killing. I mean, blood-soaked pages in a lot of cases. One of the very first stories in the Bible is rather breathtakingly harsh, and that's a brother killing another brother. It's always considered incredibly serious, and the further we go into Judeo-Christian thought, in the latter part of the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, it becomes more and more serious to murder someone. We tend to downplay passion, anger, as an excuse. We say, no, you either needed to exert control or you needed to learn how to exert control, one or the other, but you were still responsible because of the damage done to other people. You might think it's odd that you get satisfaction out of anger, but people do all the time. And I'm going to be angry now, and I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to continue to be angry, and nothing that you are going to say is going to change the fact that I was wronged, that someone hurt me or hurt the ones I love, etc. So I take satisfaction out of that, and I can take an immediate satisfaction versus having to be able to achieve a type of peace or tranquility or forgiveness. Well, a lot of people would say that we should go back to the Old Testament, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, or the lex talionis. That just shows they haven't read much of the Old Testament at all. The idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth would be a pretty brutal way to live, if you think about it. We tend to structure our societies in what we consider to be a much more civilized way, and that is where we remove revenge and anger from the individual. You know why? Because we don't do it very well. You don't think too clearly when you're angry, when you want revenge, and that in its way, it's natural too. And frankly, I'd rather live in a civilized society where we take into account that people don't handle their anger very well, rather than in a society which is torn apart by vendettas and blood feuds. Redemption is always possible. We believe that redemption is possible even if you've killed. We have all kinds of people who are murderers who are forgiven. Throughout Christian history, We've had people who've been forgiven. They've been redeemed. Their debt has been redeemed, has been paid for by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean that they don't have to suffer other consequences. They may not be safe to be let back out in society. I've been a prison chaplain for years. I'm no bleeding heart, okay? People can be redeemed by the power and the sacrifice of Christ. It doesn't mean they're not dangerous, okay? So it doesn't mean they should all be let out on the street just because they've had a true, genuine conversion. And it doesn't mean that they don't have to pay the price in our time and society for that. The most vicious of people isn't an animal. He's a human being. And I think we have to be really clear about that. We don't like to think about that. As a person who goes into the prisons, the super jails and the rest, on a very regular basis, you know what we like to do? Put them behind walls, don't think about it. Because who wants to confront evil? And evil is so difficult to try to change. Social workers aren't going to change evil. Only God himself can change evil.